Yeah, g'day. Just making my way into Parliament in the usual Wellington traffic on a Monday morning. Saw a video on social media that I thought was worth responding to because it's quite clever but ultimately misleading, and I wanted to give you my version of why that is. You might have seen the video.
David Seymour introduced the Treaty Principles Bill into Parliament yesterday, and so this is the quickest breakdown I can possibly do about why that's bad for anybody that doesn't have time to look into it.
It's really quite friendly. It's really just an old mate who has done a bit of research because she's got the time and you don't, and she can explain a few things that'll probably make you feel more informed, and you happen to agree with it, so carpe, I guess. Except as you go through, you find that she's told you some things that are really basic and not really controversial at all, and then laid on some of her own assertions which maybe you mightn't have agreed with if you saw both sides, and then missed the wider picture completely, leaving you half informed or perhaps worse, misinformed. The video starts off saying,
when the treaty was signed in 1840, there were two versions, one in Māori and the other in English. And the English and Māori version of the treaty don't match up, and that's one of the biggest issues with the Treaty of Waitangi. But a really key thing to remember is that the majority of Māori rangatira signed the Māori version.
But that's all accepted and not really new. She then goes on to say correctly that the treaty principles that the courts have brought out are an attempt to reconcile the fact that Maori signed one version of the treaty and perhaps the Crown had in mind another version, so you had to form some principles to try and make a sense of the ground in the middle. That's true as well. She then goes on to make a slightly more controversial assertion.
Absolutely nowhere in the Māori version does it say we cede sovereignty.
And she goes through the different meanings of tiro rangatiratanga and kāwanatanga and what the chiefs might have meant. And this is an area of some debate. There are people who say it's unthinkable that the chiefs would have given sovereignty to just a couple of thousand English people. However, another view of that is that it completely undermines the wisdom and foresight of the chiefs at the time. Many had travelled to Sydney, some had even travelled to London. They had an understanding that the British had powers that were much greater than anyone else in the world. They were the superpower of their time. The chiefs had just spent a lot of time trying to procure their technology, particularly muskets, and that had led to the musket wars, where more people died inside New Zealand than had died going over and being killed in World War I. So they actually had considerable respect for what the British could do, and they understood what it meant to become part of what was then called the British Empire. The second point she makes is that
Māori were guaranteed tino rangatiratanga over their homes, over their lands and over their possessions or taonga.
Well, it actually says all of the people of New Zealand. I believe that that should be all of the people in perpetuity, and saying that everyone has the basic rights to their property, to their language, to their culture, doesn't take anything away from Māori.
His new bill redefines the second article of the treaty to say that everyone in New Zealand gets tino rangatiratanga.
All it really does is guarantee that those rights are more deeply appreciated, ingrained and universal. That's a couple of points where she starts off saying something uncontroversial and then says something you might not agree with after all. But there's a much bigger and wider problem here. If we take the principle of partnership, that there's a partnership between races, or that there's a partnership between Māori and the Crown, either way you end up in a place where we're a society based on two collectives, and your membership of a collective depends on your ancestry. The real question, and the real challenge from the Treaty Principles Bill, is how is that supposed to work? Where in the world has it worked to divide people up by their ancestry, instead of saying, as the Treaty Principles Bill provides, that you are a human being with universal human rights? How are we going to solve problems like getting more homes built when you have to ask two different types of people whether or not they can develop their property? That's what happens now under the Resource Management Act, where you have to ask people who are Māori separately because of their different status in this partnership. How do we make sure that we get education and health right, when we constantly have to look at each other as members of a collective based on ancestry, when in reality our country is built on many different types of people with many different backgrounds who have, in many cases, intermarried and have shared heritage. It just doesn't make sense to divide New Zealand into two types of people based on ancestry when there aren't really even two distinct groups of people anyway. The reason behind the Treaty Principles Bill, and I thought it was unfortunate to say that it's a lie, is that it's based on what works for New Zealand in the long term. You can have all the arguments about whether the chief-seated sovereignty or whether tiroranga tiratanga should apply to all people. That's fine. If you want to disagree with me, you can, but then you've got to explain how it's going to work to have a society based on two different types of people when actually there aren't two different types of people, there are just human beings in our society. If you'd like to find out more about the Treaty Principles Bill and make up your own mind based on reading the facts, you don't have to rely on your friendly mate who's done it all for you and told you the story so well. You can actually look for yourself at treaty.nz.